It's crazy to say this out loud, but at this point, I've been tuning cars for half of my life, and I've both helped and watched a ton of people just getting started with tuning. And I've also been fortunate enough to watch tons of professionals tune as well. Let's go over 10 of the mistakes that I see rookie tuners make over and over again. If you find yourself making any of these mistakes, don't get discouraged. Sometimes I see the professionals doing it as well. It happens to everybody at times for different reasons, myself included. It's just like sometimes you forget to think. I'm gonna start with this first one because I very distinctly remember that this was me 110% when I was first getting started. Number one, becoming brain dead once you get into the car. My guess is that you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that. At least hopefully I'm not alone on that. What would happen to me is I'd be all excited to sit in the car and get started, and all of a sudden as soon as I got in the car, it was like I forgot everything that I knew and I didn't know where to begin. Ironically ties into the next mistake perfectly, but the primary reason for this to happen is when you try to get started without having a clear game plan of what you're actually going to do. Simply thinking, I'm going to jump into this car and tune it, it just becomes overwhelming. Even to this day, I break up the tuning process into multiple steps. It makes it far less intimidating. I actually have an 8-step roadmap. I can email you basically an outline of the steps that I take when I'm tuning a car. Just click on the link in the description to sign up for that. It's technically for Holley EFI, but really can be applied or adapted to any software. Number two, starting to learn on a car that you care about. Starting to learn how to tune on a car that's just a giant pile of crap takes all of the stress away. This might not always be an option for everybody, but if it is an option, I strongly encourage starting with something that if it explodes, it's not going to ruin your life. The best way to calm the nerves that I just mentioned is to get your feet wet with tuning on a car that you don't care about. If you just spent $150,000 on a project and it's your only form of transportation, and if it quits running, you're going to get fired from your job since you can't get to work, you're probably going to be shitting razor blades the entire time you're trying to tune it, which isn't very fun. Nothing guarantees that you're going to make a mistake, like being afraid that you're going to make a mistake. If at all possible, try to get started on a car that you really don't care about. You can't convince me that a car that you don't care about isn't more fun than a car that you actually do care about if you use it correctly. And sometimes big turd cars can be a ton of fun too. They're slow, but you can drive them as hard as you want 100% of the time, and you don't have to worry about it breaking or going to jail. So if you're lucky enough to have a car like that, by all means, have fun with it and enjoy it. So not the first, but one of the very first cars I ever tuned was a Honda that had all of the parts to make about 600 horsepower or so. And back then, a 600 horsepower 4-cylinder was basically the same thing as a top fuel car. It was so stressful. I don't wish that stress on anybody who is just learning how to do this. And if you're wondering how that whole situation went,
oh shit, not good.
We'll come back to that on mistake number 7. So yeah, if you can borrow a crappy car from a friend, or a group of friends go in to get a crappy car, or you're fortunate enough to be able to just have a crappy car, if you can put whatever ECU in it that you're planning on using on your, the car that you actually care about, and starting with that, it's going to make that learning process a lot more enjoyable. Number 3, it seems when it comes to learning how to tune, there are two very different types of people, and it seems that there are very few in between. They're either the type that are so overly cautious, they never really make any changes, or they make such small changes, it actually ends up doing more harm than good, or the exact opposite end of the spectrum, where they're tuning their first car and they want to run 100 pounds of boost with max timing on the very first pass down the racetrack when the thing's only been running for 30 seconds total. So don't be like either of those two extremes. Be somewhere in the middle. Let me give you examples of both. First example is a little bit odd and extreme. There was a shop local to me years back that actually refused to touch ignition timing. Whatever ignition map you had in your car when you drove to them is what they used. I guess this was their way of thinking that they were protecting themselves if the engines blew up. It was super weird, and they still blew stuff up, so it didn't really help. I don't know if they were scared of it or scared of the liability or didn't know how to do it or what, but could you imagine what a red flag it would be if you took your car to get tuned and they told you that they're not going to touch the ignition timing? On the other end of the spectrum, a quick story. I had a customer with a pro mod using my dyno. Part of my procedure when putting cars on the dyno is to make like a half run or something, or a low power run, to make sure the car isn't going to fly off the dyno and kill everybody. And this customer was the first customer I've ever had who was actually not okay with that. And they only wanted to do full power, max RPM runs right from the get-go. And his reason was that the motor could only, have so many passes or so many runs on it before it needed to be serviced. Now, keep in mind that this car was going to make, somewhere around 3,000 horsepower. So felt a little sketchy just going for gold right on the first run. It kind of goes against everything I believe in. So anyways, they made their first run, and luckily the car didn't blast off into outer space. And down low, it ran okay, but at higher RPM, it was, spitting, sputtering, misfiring, totally unhappy. And this thing was running probably about 50 or 55 pounds of boost. So after the run, they looked at the log and it started misfiring above, I forget the exact number, let's say it was 25 pounds of boost. This car had fuel tech in it, not that it matters, but it was maxing out the closed loop correction. So they decided to just subtract 50% of fuel from the entire fuel table above 25 pounds of boost. So this means that the fuel map actually had significantly less fuel in it above 25 pounds than it did below, which, as you can imagine, is not a good idea. Long story short, pretty sure that 8 of the 8 pistons all turned into liquid and shot out of the exhaust. So the lesson there is to always, baby step into your changes, trying to not have to service the engine, in this case, guaranteed having to service the engine much sooner than anticipated. So even on something making, significantly less horsepower and not being so far out in left field on the initial run, if your correction is 10% off or something like that, you might not want to take the full 10% right from the get-go. You might want to take half that or however you see fit. Same thing goes with ignition timing. If you suspect that an engine's going to want 30 degrees and you started at 25, I probably wouldn't just immediately throw an additional 5 degrees in it. I'd probably chop that in half and make a couple of runs. And it's a lot less time consuming to make a couple of runs than it is to replace everything. And on that note, that kind of jumps into our next mistake, number 4, which is underestimating the value of using a dyno, even if it's just for a few hours. I totally understand that some of you live in places where there isn't a dyno around, but probably even more of you live somewhere where there's no racetrack anywhere to be found. Yet I see so many people that are willing to make a 20-hour drive to take an untested car to an event just to make an ass out of themselves, unfortunately. I'm sure a lot of people will disagree with me on this, but I could go on for hours about how much more beneficial spending some time on a dyno would be versus just going racing, for most people, especially with an untested car, and even more so if you're just getting started on tuning. Just trying to go for gold at the racetrack and not really knowing or understanding or having a ton of experience is just a recipe for disaster. Being able to see the exact cause and effect of the change that you're making while eliminating 100 different racetrack related variables is just, in my opinion, invaluable. I could do an entire video on this topic, so let me know if anybody cares enough for me to make that. And where the dyno really shines, aside for all of the obvious stuff, but maybe something you don't take into consideration, is when there is problems with the car. I can't think of anything worse in the world than having a problem with a car. You try and make it pass down the track, it spits, sputters, or doesn't do what it's supposed to do, and it's a busy event or whatever it is, and you have to wait 4, 5, 6, 8 hours before you make your next run. And if you didn't find the problem and fix it, and you just wasted an 8-hour day at the track to have exactly the same problem again, I would run as fast as I could head first into a cement wall in that scenario. As to where if you're at the dyno and that same thing happens, you can make 15 runs in an hour if you need to in order to try and troubleshoot the problem. And even with street cars, sometimes just being able to make a run, with the hood popped, where you can have a set of eyeballs looking in the engine bay just to find out that something that you never would have thought of is actually happening, and just not having to pull over on the side of the road 100 different times. Or again, I could talk about this for hours. Mistake number 5 is not understanding what all of the stuff in the tuning software actually does. There is way more to tuning than just the main fuel table. I see the overwhelming majority of people learning how to tune that just open up the laptop, connect it to the car, and try to just sort of figure it out as they go. And in all fairness, I think it's pretty much common practice for all of us to do that when it comes to getting something new. Who wants to research something for 1,000 hours before you actually get to use it? I think a perfect example of this is when you get a new car nowadays. All these cars have basically full-blown iPads or whatever you want to call it in the dash. They all have their own interface, this, that, the other. I think every person on the planet just hops in the driver's seat, starts driving, and starts pushing buttons as you go down the road, and eventually you sort of figure it out. Or in the case of me, I've had my truck for about a year and I've put like 5,000 miles on it. I never drive it, and I never really push the buttons buttons. And, my wife's always the one in the passenger seat. She knows how to navigate far better than I do. I just look at it and get frustrated, and I surely don't have the time to research it. So I know how to do the handful of things that I know how to do. Everything else I don't really care about. So when it comes to tuning, just make sure that you care about that other stuff, because it's very important. You need to take care of the whole thing when it comes to tuning. If you don't know much about this part of it and you just ignore it, it could cause everything else to, not run very good or not run as good as it could. So definitely take the time to learn what all of the stuff does. Kind of the cheat code with that is getting yourself familiar with the software before you actually get started on tuning. It'll make a world of a difference. Just being able to, sit on the living room couch and push buttons and, go through everything, go through the help menu, all of that. That way, when you actually sit down in the car, you'll have somewhat of an idea of what you're doing, where everything is, and you're going to end up having a lot better of an experience doing it rather than spending all your time fumbling around trying to figure out where things are. The way my brain personally works is I found that I learn best if I do some research on the front side of it, and then I go out and try whatever it is that I'm trying to do. And at that point, I have a much better understanding of what I don't know. So then I can go back and research that stuff specifically, and then I can go and apply it again. And on that note, if you're using Holley FI and you want to learn what all of the stuff does in just kind of one organized place, click the link in the description and I have something you might be interested in. Mistake number 6. Most people want to tune the car without actually tuning the car. They just want the answers. That probably sounds really weird. Let me explain. I mentioned how so many people seem to think that tuning is all done just in the main fuel table, which basically means that they think that they're just trying to hit their target air fuel ratio or whatever with as close to a 0% correction as possible. And yes, that is in fact a large percentage of tuning and probably the most time consuming part. However, hitting any of those targets is only half of the battle because choosing those targets in the first place is not as simple as picking a value and shooting for it. You need to move that target around and see what the car or what the engine actually likes. It's normal to start with a range for a particular engine and combo, but if you're not experimenting with different targets, you're really only doing half of the tuning process. This is something to keep in mind when you take your car to a shop and they make 2 pulls on the dyno and then they tell you that it's done. They didn't do any experimenting or testing or tweaking. They just started with some values that they thought were going to be right and assumed that they were right. And in all fairness, a lot of times those numbers are right, but there are definitely exceptions to that, and those exceptions are frequent enough that I think it's worth doing on every car, at least assuming that you take pride in what you're doing and you want to do a good job. As an example, last week I did 2 cars with nearly identical setups, same fuel, same engine, all of that. They were both naturally aspirated. The first car made max power with an air fuel ratio of 12.9, which is exactly what I would expect for that combo. And the next car with, again, the same combo, the same dyno, the same day, the same fuel, all of it, it made max power with a 11.6 air fuel ratio. And it wasn't just a small difference in power, it was pretty significant. If you're not familiar, that is an air fuel ratio for a turbo car, very out of place on a naturally aspirated car. But if we didn't experiment with different target air fuel ratios and the dyno didn't tell us that it liked being richer, liked being richer, liked being richer, there would have been no reason to try such a rich target. That's rare and an extreme example, but it does happen far more often than you would think. And then I had another car just a couple of days ago that made max power with about 4 degrees less timing in it than what the other 100 of that exact combo I've done would typically want. So if you just assume that the targets that you think that the car are going to like are correct without actually testing it, again, you're only kind of doing half the job, and you might potentially be leaving a bunch of power on the table, or you might be far more aggressive with the tuning than what really needs to happen. In that particular example, there's no reason to have 4 degrees more timing in this engine than what it clearly wanted. So by experimenting with the targets, being able to remove 4 degrees, now we have more power or the same power, but we have a much larger safety net on the engine not exploding. Mistake number 7 is not understanding that sometimes the problem is with the car and not with the tune. Okay, remember that 600 horsepower Honda I mentioned in problem number 2? That car unfortunately did not make anywhere near 600 horsepower, and you couldn't convince me at the time that it wasn't a result of something that I was doing wrong.
Everything Joe touches turns to shit.
I spent days and days on the dyno, and and it seemed like no matter what I did, it didn't make a difference. Just hit a complete brick wall at 450 horsepower or roughly, which was still a lot of power back then, but it was well short of the goal. And a lot of the parts on this particular car were brand new, best of the best. And again, back then I didn't realize that just because a part's new doesn't mean it's good. Unfortunately, but I was just dead set on the tune being the problem, because I think I was just so nervous and worried that I was going to blow it up. I thought I was just being way too conservative, and I'd try and baby step into some timing or baby step into this, that, and the other, and it just nothing seemed to make a difference. So again, I just thought it was me that was the problem. I eventually accepted defeat, that I just sucked, and I stepped back from the car, and later, just totally coincidentally, decided to change some of the setup on the car, and I had never seen this problem before, so I have no idea why I decided to do it, but I just so happened to take the downpipe off and look inside of the downpipe for whatever reason, and come to find out that this is a well-known and common problem now, but back then, again, I had never seen this before. Looking in the downpipe, the flex bellow had collapsed, and there was, maybe a half-inch at best hole that all of the exhaust was trying to pass through. Now, considering that car was making 450 horsepower with essentially a half-inch exhaust on it, I'm pretty confident that we could have went well over the 600 horsepower mark at that point, which looking back is, well, I guess not so much looking back, is at that point in time, it was super kind of like frustrating. Like, oh man, it's just a little bit too late here, because the car was already too far taken apart to put it back together and try it again. Probably would have been a pretty big confidence booster that early on to kind of clear that 600 horsepower goal on that car. So the takeaway here is, if a car is running bad or down on power, or it won't idle, or whatever the case may be, just take a step back and do some diagnosing on the car itself. The odds of it being a problem with the car is probably higher than it being a problem with the tune, unless maybe you're an absolute beginner, then it's possible that you're all the way out in left field. Everybody has to start somewhere, so again, don't let that be discouraging. But if you've been tuning long enough to have at least a little bit of an understanding of what you're looking at, what you're doing, it really seems like tuning is 90% troubleshooting and fixing stuff and 10% tuning. So just don't forget to take a step back and verify that everything on the car is actually correct. Mistake number 8 is not understanding that O2 sensor data can often be inaccurate. This mistake could technically be tied into the last one, but it deserves its own spotlight as it's such a common mistake. Beginners, for whatever reason, take what the O2 sensor says to the grave with them, and probably one of the best skills that you can learn when it comes to tuning is learning how and when to ignore what the O2 sensor is telling you. Probably sounds kind of weird, but when you see how often they are totally wrong, it would make more sense. And for those of you that are relying on closed loop or the learn table or whatever the ECU you're using calls it, any of these like self-tuning type of stuff, this gets you into trouble all of the time, again, when you're just totally relying on what the O2 sensor is telling you. So many people with new builds will, put a motor in a car, bolt a set of headers on, and just try and get it started up and running, maybe so they can just move it around or make sure nothing's leaking before they put an exhaust system on the car. And then the O2 sensor just reads dead lean, so it's just dumping a ton of fuel into the engine because it's getting a false reading. It ends up fouling plugs and this, that, the other. And if you're just looking at the O2 sensor data, you're going to think that the thing is dead lean and start trying your troubleshooting based off of that. But if you ignore what the O2 sensor tells you and you pull out the spark plugs and see that they're spray painted black, it's pretty obvious to tell that the car is in fact overly rich and the O2 sensor is not telling you the truth. So it can be super frustrating to kind of be in that situation, and the problem is in this direction, but you're going in this direction. Now, I also see the same thing with the turbo guys all the time. They'll bolt, turbo kit on the car, and they'll do a 90-degree bend out of the hood as their downpipe. So the downpipe 6 inches long at best, and the O2 sensor just reads so far off that it makes it basically impossible to use for tuning. A lot of times in those situations, the O2 will come back full throttle once you start getting a bunch of exhaust going past it, but idle, cruising, part throttle, stuff like that. And this can become a real problem with remote tuning as well. So a lot of times you're using your other senses to figure out what the car wants and needs, since the O2 sensor data can be so misleading. If the person on the other end of the remote tune doesn't know that your downpipe is 6 inches long and they see that the air-fuel ratio is super lean, they're just going to keep adding fuel. And honestly, probably the worst thing that can happen is that the O2 sensor starts reading in the range of what the target is that you're looking for, but it's reading false lean. So in reality, the thing's just in the toilet rich, but the tuner, from what he can tell, is, he thinks he's right where he needs to be. And unless you're able to inform the tuner, well, one, you should tell him that your downpipe sucks. And then two, usually if you have some familiarity with this, you can kind of be able to tell once the car starts running rich, especially if it gets to the point where it's audibly running bad and things like that. Again, this is a skill that you sort of learn after you do this for quite a while. I had a 60 something, whatever it was, Corvette towed to me not too long ago. They started it, pulled it out of the trailer, and before they even got it all the way out of the trailer, I was like, this thing is nowhere remotely close to correct. So loaded up in the trailer and gave them a list of things to check out and got it sorted out. But before they brought the car, they had sent me some videos of the thing running and some videos of the screen and the air fuel. Everything looked right. And the audio was so blown out on it, you couldn't really tell. But within 5 seconds of hearing the car run, it was blatantly obvious the thing was probably running on 3 or 4 cylinders at best. But again, the O2 data showed that it was running properly. Another thing people forget to take into consideration is that the O2 sensor is reading an average of however many cylinders are running to it in that particular exhaust pipe. So extreme example, just to paint the picture, if you have a single turbo on a V8, you have all 8 cylinders collecting into the downpipe. So you very well might have one injector that's essentially hung open and 7 cylinders that are all extremely lean, but the combination of all 8 of those might kind of become somewhat of a stable number or something that's acceptable, or it still might be running lean, or it very well may show that it's running rich. So you might keep leaning it out, keep leaning it out, keep leaning it out. Now the average of all of the cylinders is starting to look a little bit more presentable, but those 7 cylinders are so lean that you end up melting the motor down, which can become even more confusing when you're looking at the log and you're like, this thing is still really rich. Why is it melting the cylinders down? So of all of the different mistakes on this list, learning how and when to ignore the O2 sensor is definitely the hardest thing to learn. Mistake number 9 is not data logging and just trying to view the data real time, and then also not saving the data logs appropriately. So this one is a bit crazy to me. So many people buy ECUs and try to tune them, but never actually data log anything. They just look at the real-time display. I probably get 100 emails a week of people with XYZ problem wanting to know what the issue is. But when you ask for a log, they don't even know like what you're talking about. So you paid for an entire EFI system. Don't just use half of it. Use and take advantage of the data logger. A lot of times people will be on the fence between 2 different ECUs, and the deciding factor is which one has the better data logger. So it is an extremely important and beneficial part of EFI. And again, you have to take advantage of it. It's so important. And I do get that the data logs can look a bit intimidating with a bunch of just squiggly lines everywhere, but tuning without it is arguably impossible, especially as the power levels go up. Your data logs are literally a snapshot of what's happening in your tune, and it is step number 1 when diagnosing basically any problem. If there was an EFI ECU on the market that didn't have data logging, I don't think that anybody would buy it. And additionally, the default names and locations for the logs in most ECUs aren't ideal. So I would encourage you to organize everything within folders and name each log something that makes sense. As an example, you can start a folder, just call it, my car, if you're not tuning a bunch of other people's cars. And then you can start another subfolder within that folder, and you can name that like cruise air fuel ratio if that's what you're working on at that point in time. And then within that cruise AFR folder, you could name the actual data log like 14.5 AFR test or something like that. Some indication of whatever change it was that you tried on that data log. You can also set up your file structure based off of location for, say, different racetracks, by date if you prefer to do it that way. Just don't save 40,000 files all to the default location with the default names with no organization. Then you can't go back and reference anything. So you'll just have all these super helpful data logs right in front of your face that kind of don't do you any good because you don't know what the changes and the differences are between them, or at least not in an effective way. And then, by the way, all of these saved data logs can really save you when it comes time to troubleshoot problems down the road. mode. So let's say you have a data log from when your car was running perfectly fine and great, and now all of a sudden your car is running like a pile of crap. If you take both of those data logs and you overlay them and you compare the difference, 9 times out of 10 you can spot what the difference is. And once you figure out what the difference is, then you can begin troubleshooting and save yourself what feels like 1,000 hours in some instances. Rookie tuner mistake number 10 that I see is people starting to offer tuning services and taking people's money before they are ready to do so. With how long I've been doing this stuff, I've seen so many tuners come and go. A lot of times what ends somebody's tuning journey before they even really get started is when they start to try to charge for their services before they should. Have you ever noticed the guys that are popping up in all these different Facebook groups that are offering $20 or $50 remote tunes? They disappear just as fast as they pop up. Instead of just popping up trying to undercut everybody and clearly just doing a terrible or uneducated job, if they would just keep building on their skill set and wait until their services were, worth charging for and worth more than, pennies on the dollar, then, they very well could potentially have a career doing this. But if you jump the gun and you just start charging and doing this stuff when you have no business doing so, it's kind of a quick and early nail in the coffin. Have you ever heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect? I think this kind of ties into this pretty well a lot of times. So it's basically where you don't know anything about a particular skill or something that you're trying to do. And as you learn a little bit of information really early on in the process, you suddenly think that you know everything, or at least a lot. And then as you continue to learn or continue to do whatever this thing is, you quickly realize that you don't know nearly as much as you thought you did. So you just kind of like plummet as far as your confidence goes. And that might sound like it's a bad thing, but I think it's a really good thing, because once you hit that low point, then it seems like your learning curve follows what I would consider to be like a natural progression of learning something new. And then probably more important for this example is I think that peak is where you get yourself into trouble. So you start learning, you think you know everything, you start trying to collect money here, and it just goes all bad. So if you get to this peak, you realize you don't know everything and your confidence level drops, and now you can start that natural progression. As you move up that curve, I think just the decisions that you're going to make and your worth and who you should be charging and when, and just all of that other stuff, I think you're going to be in a lot better shape kind of doing it at that point in time. But the reality is that everybody has to start somewhere, and I don't think you need to be a genius master tuner guy in order to provide helpful and honest support for people that you can eventually charge for. But just like everything else in life, there's a right way and a wrong way to go about it. If you are interested in learning more about how to make some extra money with your tuning knowledge, or even interested in becoming a full-time tuner, click the last link in the description to learn more.